My name is Casey Everett. I'm 25 years old, an IT engineer living in Salem, Oregon. If you ask me where I truly belong, I'd answer without hesitation. The wooden cabin by Lake Fairview, where I shared unforgettable memories with my grandparents. That place wasn't just a house. It was a world where I learned honesty, patience, and love. But this story isn't just about me. It's about my family, about deep fractures, and about a betrayal I never saw coming. I grew up in two opposite worlds. One was the cabin where my grandfather George and grandmother Ruth built a warm, loving home. The other was the cold mansion in West Salem Heights, where my parents, Stephen and Marjorie, lived with their ambitions and suffocating control. My grandfather, George Everett, was an extraordinary man. At 78, he still carried the strong presence of a former U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel. He was tall, with silver hair and a straight back, but what I remember most are his eyes, gentle and profound. My grandmother Ruth was the heart of the family, tempering his sternness with her grace. She taught me to listen not just with my ears, but with my heart. The summer days of my childhood with them were the most beautiful times of my life. I'd wake before dawn and join my grandfather on the porch, listening to his stories about his military days, not of battles, but of courage and honor. Discipline is the highest expression of self-respect, Casey, he'd say. If a person can't keep a promise to themselves, how can they keep one to others? 2 years ago, my grandmother Ruth passed away in her sleep. My grandfather, a man so proud he never needed anyone's help, was left alone in the cabin, a shell of the man he once was. His loneliness was a palpable thing, a wall separating him from the world. My parents, who had always been distant, suddenly began visiting him frequently. My father, Stephen, is a financial advisor, always impeccably dressed. My mother, Marjorie, is a behavioral psychologist, fiercely ambitious and a believer that control is a form of love. Dad, my father said one evening, his voice gentle but somehow insincere, "We think it's time for you to come live with us. We can take care of you better." My mother added sweetly, "You shouldn't be alone like this. We're so worried." I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was a chance for our family to heal. My grandfather resisted at first. "I don't want to be a burden," he'd say. But after months of their persistence, he reluctantly agreed. "For Casey," he told me, his eyes gentle, "I don't want you worrying about me forever." On the day he moved, he stood before the cabin one last time. "Promise me we'll come back," he said. I promised, but a heavy unease weighed on me. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly. My mother prepared his meals, reminded him to take his medication, and even bought him a new armchair. But after just a few weeks, I began to notice small, unsettling changes. My grandfather, a man with a mind as sharp as a razor, started forgetting little things. Where he put his glasses, the name of an old neighbor. He seemed more tired, often drowsy, his speech slow. It's a normal response for someone his age. My mother, with her psychologist's expertise, reassured me. "He's adjusting." I wanted to believe her, but a premonition stirred. Then I started noticing strange things. My mother always prepared my grandfather's coffee alone in the kitchen. One day, I walked in just as she was pouring something from a small vial into his cup. She flinched, quickly tucking it away. "Just some sugar," she said with a perfect smile. But my grandfather never took sugar in his coffee. He always said it had to be bitter like life. After drinking it, he would become unusually drowsy, sometimes nodding off in his chair just minutes later. One morning, driven by a desperate need to know the truth, I visited early. My grandfather was at the dining table with his coffee. When he stood to get his reading glasses, leaving the nearly full cup behind, an irresistible urge took over. I took a small, quick sip. The familiar bitter taste washed over my tongue. But there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness. Minutes later, my mind grew foggy. My eyelids felt heavy. I tried to focus, but my thoughts were hazy, slipping away. I steadied myself in the kitchen, my heart pounding. It was a scream in my mind now. There was something in the coffee. I needed proof. A few days later, I returned, bringing a small vial. When my mother prepared his coffee, I deliberately spilled some water, and in the moment she turned to grab a towel, I quickly poured a bit of his coffee into my vial. My hands trembled. I took the sample to Liam, an old college friend who worked in a lab. "Casey, are you sure you want to test this?" he asked. "I just need to know." I said. 2 days later, he called me to the lab, his face grim. "Casey," he said, handing me a report, "there's Ambien in the coffee. A sedative. The dose is low, but long-term, it can cause confusion, temporary memory loss, and impaired focus." The world collapsed around me. Ambien. The symptoms matched perfectly. My parents were poisoning my grandfather. But why? I didn't confront them. Not yet. I needed more evidence. That evening, when they were out, I quietly went to the mansion and installed 2 tiny hidden cameras, one in the kitchen and one in my father's study. I felt like I was betraying them, but I knew I had no other choice. A few days later, I checked the footage. My heart pounded as I pressed play. The screen lit up, showing the kitchen. My mother appeared, pulled the small vial from her purse, and carefully sprinkled white powder into a coffee cup. "Be careful, Marjorie," my father's voice said from off-camera. "No one will notice," she replied, her tone cold. "He's not himself anymore." I switched to the camera in my father's study. My mother stood beside him, handing him a sheet of paper. "Sign it, Stephen," she said. "This is the power of attorney for the estate. Once your father is in the nursing home, everything will be easier." My father hesitated, then signed, his hand trembling. I closed the laptop, unable to breathe. Power of attorney. A nursing home. They weren't just drugging him. They were planning to take everything he had. I showed the videos to my grandfather. I watched his face harden as he saw his own son and daughter-in-law's betrayal. When the final video ended, he sat in silence, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "All my life, I taught him honesty," he said softly, his voice trembling. I told him I want to call the police, but he shook his head. "Slow down, Casey. We need to know what they're planning next." From that day on, my grandfather began to act. He pretended his confusion was worsening, that he was growing weaker. It was a masterful performance, but seeing the man who taught me about discipline feign weakness was a knife to my heart. The moment came on Thanksgiving. My parents hosted a lavish dinner, inviting relatives and friends. My mother stood and raised her wine glass. "We're here to give thanks," she began sweetly. "And I want to thank my father-in-law, George. But lately, his mental health has been declining. We believe a nursing home will be the best place for him. For his health, we're also finalizing the power of attorney to manage his affairs." The room filled with murmurs of sympathy and approval. I couldn't sit still any longer. I stood up. "Before we go on," I said, my voice calm, "I have a video I'd like to show to capture some memorable moments of my grandfather." My mother frowned, but before she could object, I connected my phone to the large screen in the living room and pressed play. The video I had carefully compiled from the hidden cameras began. The scene of my mother sprinkling powder into the coffee. The scene of my father signing the power of attorney. The cold, calculated conversations. The room went deathly silent. A wine glass shattered. My mother's face went pale. My father stood abruptly. "Casey, what are you doing? This is a misunderstanding. It's just a supplement." But before I could respond, my grandfather stood. He rose slowly, no longer showing any trace of confusion. His eyes were icy. "Enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "No more excuses, Marjorie. Stephen, I've seen everything. I know everything." He turned to my father, his eyes filled with a pain that was unwavering. "Stephen, I spent my life teaching you about honesty. What have you done with those lessons?" Just then, the doorbell rang. 2 police officers stepped inside. "Mr. Stephen Everett, Mrs. Marjorie Everett." One said, "We have a warrant to bring you in for questioning regarding the illegal use of prescription drugs and suspected poisoning." My mother burst into tears. My father bowed his head in silence. The Thanksgiving dinner had become a day of reckoning. As the officers stepped forward, my grandfather raised his hand. "Please, officers, hold on," he said, his gaze steady. "I want to withdraw the complaint. This is a family matter, and I want to handle it myself." I was stunned. After everything they had done, how could he choose forgiveness? "What I need," he said, turning to my parents, "isn't to see my son punished. What I need is for him to understand his mistakes." He looked at the gathered guests, his voice trembling but firm. "Stephen, Marjorie, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to live with hatred in my heart. But for now on, you must live with the truth of what you've done. Your greatest punishment is this shame." My father dropped to his knees, his head bowed low, his body shaking with silent sobs. My mother remained hunched over the table, her hands covering her face. That night, the Everett family Thanksgiving ended not with laughter, but with silence, sorrow, and the forgiveness of a father. A few weeks later, my grandfather decided to move back to the cabin by Lake Fairview. I helped him pack. As we stood on the porch for the last time, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "This isn't the last time we'll be here," he said. I knew he was right. I spent most of my free time visiting him, helping him repair the porch and restore my grandmother's garden. One day, he told me of an old dream: to sail the seas, to live his final years free. I supported him wholeheartedly. He sold his remaining assets and purchased a lifetime cabin on a luxurious cruise ship. Before he left, he handed me a thick envelope. "Casey," he said, "I want you to keep this cabin. This is your inheritance. Protect it, as I protected what your grandmother left behind." It wasn't just an inheritance, it was trust. I drove him to the port. As he boarded the ship, he turned and hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Casey," he said. "You helped me find myself again." I watched the ship disappear over the horizon, tears streaming down my cheeks. He was finally free. My parents, meanwhile, lived in the shadow of their shame. They sold the mansion and moved to a smaller house, their social standing in ruins. I rarely saw them. They needed time to face themselves. My grandfather's greatest lesson wasn't about polishing shoes or folding blankets. It was about how he chose to forgive, even when his heart had been torn apart. He taught me that honor isn't about clinging to perfection, but about rising from mistakes and helping others do the same. And I, Casey Everett, learned that true kindness lies in the courageous choice to face the truth, even when it breaks your heart.